I'd like to welcome to the ACM National Conference Suzanne Nossel, who is the CEO of PEN America. PEN was founded almost 100 years ago to defend the rights of writers and to protect free expression in the United States and internationally. PEN America is part of a network of organizations that do that, protecting the speech rights of not just writers, but creatives and all people throughout the world through its activities. Both through its creative programs as well as through its advocacy work. And we're really pleased to have Suzanne join us here today. She's the author of the book from 2020 called Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, which is published by HarperCollins. We'll talk about the book as it pertains a lot to the work that we do at PEG centers across the United States. And it has some very, very practical advice in terms of how we talk about expression and talk about the rights that we seek to defend, which is sort of something I think is very often taken for granted. So I want to welcome you to the conference, Suzanne. Thank you for joining us here and for talking with folks around the country.
Thanks for having me.
About PEN America and free speech. Why did you write the book in 2020? Why is it important now to have this type of conversation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I would say it really grew out of a concern that I had that built up over time, that we were in danger of losing a rising generation when it came to the principle of free speech, and that there was a growing cohort of young people in this country who had come to see free speech protections as inimical to the struggle for racial justice and social justice. And as someone who heads a free speech organization, that worried me. For me, growing up, the First Amendment and free speech were seen as kind of bedrock underpinnings of our own democracy, of a free world around the globe. And so to meet young people who thought, gosh, free speech or the First Amendment, these are not principles that make much sense to me. Free speech is that which protects the hateful bully who's purveying bigotry on my college campus. I sort of want no part of that. Free speech defends people, protects them, shields them from accountability for noxious and harmful speech. And so all these perceptions that had begun to kind of come up, and I think were intensified over the period of the Trump administration, during which it was as if kind of hate speech became uncorked. Taboos that had protected against the public expression of certain sentiments were loosened or evaporated, and whether it's anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Muslim sentiment, racist sentiment, sexist sentiment, a lot of that was condoned sort of from the highest levels of government. And for young people, that triggered a reaction, a censorious reaction, to say, look, if this damaging speech is going to be coursing so freely through our society, I need to do something about it. We need to draw a line in the sand when it comes to our dorm, our college dining hall, the pages of this magazine, this newsroom or workplace. And so there's a kind of push and pull effect here, but the net result of it, in my mind, really threatened the future of free speech. And so the view that I have, kind of engaging with people across the political spectrum, is that we need something of a repositioning of free speech, and we need to explain how it can coexist and reinforce the quest for a more equitable and inclusive society, that it is not at odds with that. And so in the book, I spell out 20 principles for how I think we can live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society without curbing free speech. And so there are principles for individuals in their capacity as speakers, as listeners, in debating free speech issues, and in contemplating, reflecting on what our free speech policies ought to be.
And actually, there's also sort of a host of sort of principles for being a conduit for other people's speech, which I think is sort of a continuing issue for the organizations that we work with across the country. Very often, the speech of an individual gets mapped onto the identity of the channel or the program. so much so that it's become sort of a standard practice to think of, say, for a television channel as a publisher, and therefore it's the channel's speech. I mean, that's actually like a standard now within even sort of like legal policy in America. And yet the idea that you'd be a conduit for other people's speech and that you defend it seems very, very strange to some folks now, particularly when they're used to sort of entertainment channels and identifying the channel with the speaker or with a brand identity even. So that idea of like the ethics of the speaker and the forum seems to be very much a part of what you're trying to get at within the book, to me.
Yeah, look, it's complex. I mean, there's a spectrum that now exists within society of, a traditional publisher, say a magazine publisher, where every article is carefully commissioned. Maybe it's a magazine with an overt political or ideological bent, where they really are vetting the substance of what they publish to stand by, more or less every word or idea that's contained therein. To, on the other side, the far end would be a Verizon or T-Mobile, where they are simply sort of providing the wireless service, through which billions of conversations take place, and they have absolutely no responsibility for the content. You and I could plan a conspiracy, talking on our cell phones, and nobody could go after our mobile provider, even if, it was a deadly criminal act. And then in between, of course, you have the social media companies, Facebook and Twitter and others, and that's a very contested territory. Are they sort of more like a traditional publisher, or should they be treated more like a telco? What responsibility, if any, should they have for content, say, that is criminal in nature or inciting, that appears on their platforms? They have, under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, they have immunity from legal liability, but that's hotly contested. And there are proposals now to pare that back and treat them more like a traditional publisher. And they also function in some ways, certainly much more so than a telco, like a publisher. They moderate content on the platform. They have community standards that they enforce. They pull down content all the time, whether it's pornography or nudity or hateful speech, COVID-related disinformation. And so then the constituents of your organization, community media operators, are, I think, further along on the spectrum, where they are performing an editorial function. They're deciding what goes up on air, but they're also, as part of their mission, I think in many instances, committed to presenting a breadth of views and to encompassing varied opinions, to allowing people to have their say on a whole range of issues without being boxed in. And it's a little like some of the issues we deal with at PEN America in terms of publishers. We kind of historically, publishers have sort of played the role, and bookstores, of purveying this, panoply of ideas, stories, views, perspectives, and you can walk in there and find just about anything. And now there are pressures kind of closing in that Simon & Schuster, for example, shouldn't be publishing a book by Mike Pence or Kellyanne Conway, that, so an author like Blake Bailey, the Philip Roth biographer, shouldn't be published by W.W. Norton because of his personal accusations of sexual abuse and misconduct that have been levied against him. And so it's gotten very contested. And I do think it's important to stand up for the principle of having entities and institutions within our society that are conduits for a wide breadth of views. I don't want to see the realm of community media or book publishing or book selling go down the route of what has happened on cable news, where we're very fractured and fragmented, and depending on what you believe or who you vote for, what channel you tune into is a function of that. Because I think it really undercuts the opportunity that we have that's so important, I think, to a vibrant democracy, to engage with others who have radically different views and to hear from them in their own terms. And so I hope we can preserve that space. And I think that the work of defending the importance of presenting a breadth of ideas, even ideas that may be controversial, objectionable, ideas that you disagree with, but that you nonetheless think are educational, edifying, illuminating in some way, and worth presenting to an audience?
I mean, one of the key examples I think about in terms of institutions that do that, and an institution that we tend to model ourselves after, are public libraries in America, right? Which very often are public institutions, you know, and they're government-backed institutions, but they have a public-facing mission that should, at its best sense, be open, and yet they're often contested arenas as well, in terms of how the library should be curated, the breadth of ideas that appear in a library, you know, what does the public locally demand, things like that. So it seems to me that you know, that type of contest that you're talking about, that sort of question like what ideas we should be consuming, has always been a part of our history, and it's just now the forces that we're talking about are very complex, and there's like almost like a fire hose of information that's available to folks, and people can self-select the type of information they can receive. So, you know, I think one of the key challenges is how you have a truly public conversation amongst speakers and listeners. And I think that's one of the sort of central challenges, I think, for all writers as well, is how you connect with an audience in this kind of environment.
That's right. I mean, just to say, it's you know, what's challenging about it is that it's not absolute, right? Like even in that public library, you wouldn't expect to find on an open shelf, you know, a slew of books of white supremacist, you know, dogma. You know, that wouldn't seem right for them, or, you know, or racist screeds. You know, there are some boundaries that I think kind of collectively we implicitly accept, and then yet some people take that to mean that, you know, Mark Twain, because he uses the N-word in his books, shouldn't be available on a public library bookshelf, which I think, you know, I and you and probably a lot of other people would vehemently disagree with. Or, you know, other books, even a book like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, you know, have a kind of what might be thought of as a somewhat dated depiction of race relations. So, and we deal at PEN America frequently with book bans and book challenges, and, you know, these tussles over, you know, where those boundary lines should be drawn. And it has become more fraught as we try to negotiate, you know, how we talk about our history and what aspects of historical reflection can kind of drive us forward and which perhaps set us back. And, you know, who should do the deciding? You know, should it be the librarian? Should it be a classroom teacher? Should it be just an individual reader who has access to absolutely everything, and it's within their discretion, you know, simply not to pick up the white supremacist screed? I mean, should it be available to a young child? You know, I think we would say no, but yet we want a lot of other things to be available and open it to them for choice. And so that's what makes it difficult, is that it's not as though we want absolutely everything to be openly accessible, but we do want a very wide breadth. And you know, all of that depends on a certain degree of societal consensus. You know, the fact that you know, people age 50 from the suburbs might agree, you know, on a set of books does not mean that you know, people age 25 from the inner city would see that, you know, that same collection as acceptable.
Well, I know that the concept of community standards is really very amorphous, right? And yet that has been sort of a guiding discussion, certainly for broadcasters over many years, and trying to determine what community is and what community standards are on a local level, I think very much plays that part of that consensus building that you're talking about in terms of those standards.
No, that's right. And I talk in the book about how our audience for speech has changed so drastically. You know, it used to be if you were spouting off an opinion, you know, let's say about the president, you'd be doing it, you know, perhaps in the letter to the editor of your community newspaper. And in that context, you might have a very good idea of the race, the religion, the political persuasions of the people that you're writing to. Now you're probably writing the same message on your Facebook feed. And if you make it public, it could travel all over the world. People could be reading it in other countries. People of very different ages, ideologies, may see what you've written and not understand the context, not know who you are, where you come from, how you arrive at the opinions that you hold. And sometimes the reaction can be explosive and often baseless because it is decontextualized. There isn't an understanding of the intent. Perhaps the post is satirical, and that sense of satire and humor is lost in translation. And so operating in this digital world, I argue in the book, for all of us requires a heightened level of conscientiousness. We have to think about, an audience that's not just kind of the community neatly defined, but anything I'm sure that broadcasts on a community media site, can be recorded, uploaded, transmitted. We were talking this month about this Grand Rounds presentation at Yale by this very sort of provocative psychiatrist who was, kind of glorifying violence against white people. And now, the university has disavowed it. And there's a question of whether this lecture, normally such a lecture would be available on their website. What about, are they obligated to keep this one up? And this thing has ricocheted all over the world, even though it was a lecture delivered to, a small group of physicians in a given context, but that no longer matters. It's kind of become a global story.
I'd like to talk a little bit about unpopular views and how we talk about them. You write in the book that it's important to be using empathy as you talk with audiences about unpopular views. And I'd like you to explore that a little bit, because very often, particularly within public access channels in America, there might be a disclaimer that occurs that the views of the speaker are not those of the channel. But that sort of engagement process that you're talking about, that is inherent in the concept of empathy, doesn't happen in quite the same way that you have just in a disclaimer. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about why you think empathy is so important in that conversation.
I think it operates at two levels. I think there's empathy with the speaker and empathy with the prospective listener. I think if you want to engage, if part of your mission is to engage with a breadth of views, that when you do so, you need to genuinely listen to and kind of, in a sense, for purposes of the discussion, credit what the person is saying, even if you disagree with it, and hear them out and understand the arguments and present counter arguments, but in a way that is respectful, that's aimed to elicit a genuine give and take rather than to sort of slap down or clamp down. But I also think it's important to contemplate those listeners who may have a strong reaction, and to reflect, if you're in the role, for example, as a presenter or a moderator, you're in a sense their emissary as well. And so, reflecting that some people may find this very objectionable, or, there are academics who argue that, what you've said is counterfactual, and to be prepared to present in a reasoned, factual way, some of those counter arguments that the listeners and the audience will be listening for and expecting to hear, so that it doesn't come across as if, as a presenter or a moderator, you're sort of just sitting pat and doing nothing as someone propounds views that are, perhaps offensive or factually ungrounded. And so it's a kind of a delicate balance, but I think it can be done well, so that the person speaking feels like they were treated with dignity and given an opportunity to say their piece, and the audience doesn't feel like they have witnessed sort of a shilling on behalf of a disreputable cause.
This topic kind of pops up again and again, particularly as local communities are trying to determine what the configuration of channels looks like within their community. In no small part because the configuration of channels is very much dependent upon local government and determination of needs. So even though we might have community-based organizations that are doing community expression and facilitating community expression, there has to be some type of explicit approval from local government that this is acceptable behavior, much like you'd have like in terms of setting up a library, for example. And, you typically have to have some sort of governmental consent or governmental approval for a library budget and the like. So this sometimes runs afoul in local communities where there has been a distaste for public access television specifically because of the possibility of unpopular views or the possibility of controversy. And I guess one of the questions I've got for you is how can we further the conversation with elected officials, particularly, as well as government agencies who act as a gatekeeper tacitly, that they shouldn't be a gatekeeper, or that they should have a sense of tolerance, or at least the ability to encompass all views within their community within a civic space, or that they should be creating these civic spaces to have that expression that's necessary for our democracy in our view. I mean, I'd be kind of curious what your perspective is on that.
I mean, my sense, based on the work that I've done, is that when you kind of walk people through in a measured way the argument for an open marketplace of ideas and for, for example, public access television offering that reflects a wide breadth of views, people do understand that. And, there are a series of arguments that you can make, including particularly that if you exclude certain views, that can elicit a harsh backlash, that can intensify the sense of alienation and hostility that a particular group may feel on the basis that they are being silenced or shut down or kept out of the conversation, and that it's actually better to engage them. In some ways, it can diffuse sort of the potency of their message. You can expose it to the light of day. You can contextualize it in a give and take that can offer a kind of factual rebuttal in the way that I was describing a moment ago. That these offerings should reflect the breadth of the views of the citizens, and that people should, everybody should be able to see something of themselves in the channel. And that if you see something of yourself, if there's one host that you like or one show that you appreciate, you're more likely to look at the rest of the offerings. You're more likely to sample or dabble in something that you wouldn't otherwise gravitate towards, but you were presented with it, you saw a commercial or an interstitial and you got intrigued, and maybe you watched something that you otherwise wouldn't have. And that's always been the function of, going into the library. You're looking for one book, but then you stumble across something, and maybe you end up reading, a life story of an immigrant that you never would have thought of yourself as interested in, but it sort of caught your eye and you picked it up and you were introduced to something, to a new perspective. And, it's the same with the bookstore, the power of sort of browsing and discovery. And my feeling is if that is presented, not in the context of a controversy over an individual program or, what should be within or outside of bounds, but as a more abstract discussion of, what is the role of public access media? What historically has it done? How has it operated? What are the best regarded examples, and what did they reflect? What did they look like and encompass? I think most people can actually subscribe to that sort of in the abstract. And once you've got that baseline agreement, when you get into the individual controversial case, it's not to say, you're necessarily going to win the day, but at least there is kind of that common understanding of what is the enterprise here, what is the purpose here, and why. Because I think a lot of people have lost sight of that. I mean, I think the employees of some of the publishing houses who protest certain books coming out have really kind of lost sight of something of what is the role of a major publishing house. And if that was reinforced in their orientation and in the course of, being in the professional workplace, I think some of that opposition might be blunted.
There's a case that stays with me from about a decade ago, where a transgender producer was creating satirical content at a channel, and the commission that ran the channel didn't like the content. But when faced with the possibility of censoring the individual, the commission determined that they just simply would turn off the public function of the channel and turn it into a government speech, which is totally within their rights as a franchising authority under U.S. law. But the shame of the matter is that by silencing one person, they silenced an entire community, regardless of their background, views, gender, and it's this case of being fair, but not necessarily doing what's right for your community. So I think that's what it sticks with my mind time and time again as I look at these types of cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument, I sort of make this argument when it comes to Penn America and our supporters. We take positions on a lot of controversial issues, and there's probably no one who would agree with absolutely everything we say. And what we look for is for people to agree with the general thrust of what we're doing, and to respect the fact that in carrying out that work, you've got to take a variety of views, and there are going to be differences of opinion on some of them. And I think there's an analogy there, the idea that for public officials to recognize there is some content they will not like, that they're going to find boring or distasteful or déclassé or even somewhat offensive, but that the greater good is that there is this public offering out there that's accessible to people, that has a whole smorgasbord of possibilities contained therein, and that they're capable, competent professionals who are making these decisions. And even if you disagree with them, that's inevitable. Like, there's not going to be lockstep on every single programming decision. That's unrealistic to expect.
In the time we have left, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your concern and Penn's concern for local journalism in America. Well, I mean, it's something that we've been monitoring across the country, and that our members are concerned about, because all too often now, their electronic outlets are like the sole local outlets, or are one of the dwindling number of local outlets for civic information of any kind at the local level. But tell me a little bit about your concerns that you have for
Yeah, sure. I mean, we did a major report in 2019 called Losing the News, the decimation of local news and the search for solutions. And the work really grew out of, we were becoming a more national organization. We had kind of historically been quite New York centric, but we had members across the country, and we had begun to engage with them. And we were concerned at the time sort of about the threats to press freedom that were emanating from Washington. But when we went around the country, actually it turned out that our local members were not worried about what was coming out of Washington. They were worried about the devastation of the news and information ecosystem in their own community. And so we decided to undertake the report. What we documented is this $30 billion gap in revenue that has disappeared from underwriting local news. And what's happened is very simple. It's really kind of no one's fault. It is that these local newspapers were traditionally funded by display advertising, this full-page department store ads that some of us of a certain age might remember, and classified ads for real estate and automobile and other things. And of course, all that migrated online, it disappeared, and the business model for local news organizations, went up in a puff of smoke along with it. And so what you now have, as you touched on, is either, if these newspapers still exist, they're sort of shadows of their former selves, thin and skinny without much original reporting. Many of them have disappeared entirely, more than 20%. There's been a 50% reduction in newsroom staffs for those that still exist. And what we document in the report is really a crisis of democratic accountability that has arisen as a result, because these are the journalists who were covering City Hall, the State House, the Sanitation Department, the Water Department, the Health Department. And if nobody's looking, we know what happens. Corruption is more likely, things move at a slower pace. It's difficult or impossible to hold officials accountable. And you really have this erosion of public trust in local officialdom, of transparency, of the information loop between citizenry and government. And so we put out that report. One of our major recommendations was a full-scale examination of the role of public funding in local news. And it's a solution that an area of focus that we came to, frankly, reluctantly. As a free expression organization, we don't really want the government deeply involved in journalism of any kind. But when we looked at the numbers, this $30 billion gap, there are some philanthropists and foundations that have stepped in and are doing extremely important work with startup organizations that are doing local journalism, but the scope of that is about $1 billion, $1.5 billion. It's just nowhere near equal to the size of what has vanished. And there are also some interesting new business models that are being rolled out and experimented with, but that too just shows no sign of being equal to the scale of the problem. And so we thought, we think public funding is definitely part of the puzzle of how we address this gap. We proposed creating a national commission to examine the future of local news and public funding. That now has become legislation introduced by Senator Schatz that has bipartisan support. So we're hopeful that that may go through and accelerate the search for a solution. And what kind of propelled it along over the last year was really the fact that the election and COVID were such manifestly local stories. I mean, on COVID, you couldn't know where to find PPE, where to get tested, where to get vaccinated, what the rules were without having a reliable local news source. And so it actually, the sort of ramifications of this crisis really became very apparent. And we've been sort of heartened that in Washington, they're now paying more attention.
Well, I mean, and what you're saying echoes the experience of our members across the country. Use of local channels skyrocketed during the course of the pandemic, primarily because there weren't other alternative local information sources or trusted public health information sources. So very often our members were the source and the trusted partner to be able to build that information system that was necessary. And I guess that's one of the things that we're thinking about is we think about the future of our organizations, but also like the local ecosystems that we build. They're built, they don't just sort of exist. And that's something that I think we have to be thinking about from a public policy standpoint. You talked a little bit about the hesitancy to rely upon government solutions just historically within your body. But in your book, you also talk about the hesitancy to trust corporate gatekeepers as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think very often we choose one boogeyman or another in terms of blocking expression in America.
Yeah, I think we need to be leery of all sources of power and authority when it comes to defending an open marketplace for speech. Corporations can be a threat to that. Governments can be a threat to that. Foreign governments can be a threat to that. I'm very concerned about the rising influence that just globalization and China's presence on, for example, US college campuses in Hollywood, on social media will have and is having on freedom of expression. So I think what is warranted is a real vigilance. And when it comes to the social media companies, they have dominion over such a vast swath of our public discourse. The decision about whether to, effectively silence President Trump. And, he's not silent, but he's certainly far less present in many people's lives than he was when he was active on Facebook and Twitter. And so you can see how dramatically that affects, even somebody while he was still President of the United States. And so I think it's extremely important that we be alive to and alert to the obligations that social media companies have, how they balance the imperative to mitigate serious harms that can arise when content is weaponized online. And we've seen that, in the realm of online harassment, terrorist recruitment, incitement to violence, COVID-related disinformation, false cures and quackeries circulating on social media. So those harms are very real, and we need to be responsive, but in a way that is cognizant of freedom of expression, and that is as speech protective as possible. And that requires a really sort of refined and thoughtful understanding and process for making these line drawing determinations. And from the social media companies, they rely very heavily on artificial intelligence and sort of the boundary line between how far artificial intelligence goes, at what point these determinations are kicked over to a human being, whether that human being, again, going back to our earlier discussion, knows the language, knows the political context, the ideological context, is capable of recognizing if something is satirical. There's a lot of detailed analysis involved in keeping our online marketplace for speech, at least reasonably free.
And what can folks at the local level be doing to be combating that disinformation ecosystem, if you will, building a better ecosystem to combat that disinformation? Is it embracing media literacy and educating folks to be better consumers of media? What is it?
I think that's extremely important, and we are doing trainings all across the country on what we think of as disinformation defense, equipping people to spot disinformation, to know what the indicia are of credible information, to check and verify information that is dubious, and to engage with their friends and family on that vein. And librarians actually have been a very important kind of central node because of the influence they have within their communities and their role as purveyors of information. They're very interested in being a bulwark against disinformation. So equipping and empowering them to work with library patrons and consumers to spread the word and make sure that people are information literate. I think it's extremely important to talk to family and friends about this. We're often asked the question, people come to a PEN America training on disinformation, they've at least got some awareness and interest in the problem, and yet it seems as though the real issue, which is with those who would never consider showing up because they don't recognize disinformation as spurious or false. And so how do you get to them? And the answer very often is through friends and family. That there are many people, and I'm sure some yourself, that just have people in their families who are gone down the QAnon rabbit hole, for example, or supported the Capitol Hill insurrection. And so, the bright side is that, as much as even online, those communities are very siloed and insulated and may tend to only talk to themselves. In sort of the real world, actually, these are people's uncles and cousins and brothers and neighbors, and there's an opportunity to engage with them, and that's very important.
Well, I mean, I think it's probably fitting we're talking about engaging the human heart as we're talking about defending expression as well. So your point is extremely well taken. Before we go, a couple of quick notes. If folks want to become more engaged with PEN America, what is the best way that they can do it?
Please go to our website. It's just PEN, like the old-fashioned thing, .org, and you can become a member of PEN. You can be a professional member if you're a writer, an editor, a media professional. You can also become a reader member if you just like writers, books, and free expression. Get involved in our campaigns. We will be, if you join, in touch with you. It's not expensive, and we would love to have you as part of the organization and helping us to mount this robust defense of free expression.
And ACM is proud to be a partner with PEN on your advocacy efforts for the local news commission and other activity as well. So we want to thank you for that. And if folks want to check out your book, it is Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, published by HarperCollins in this last year. Suzanne Nossel, thank you so much for joining us here today as part of our conversation at the ACM National Conference.
Thank you so much, Mike. It was great to be with you.